Joan Landino and Jane Buckley, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thank you. We're excited to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation, and it's not every day that I get to interview twins. So what a pleasure and a great opportunity. And I appreciate your areas of expertise, your background, and what you bring to the table today, as we're going to be having a discussion around trauma, personal control, and forgiveness, how that applies, of course, in our personal lives, but also specifically within the workplace. Because I don't know about each of you, but for me, I've definitely experienced my own, amount of trauma at work, and how I've interacted with colleagues, coworkers, bosses, and such. And there's a lot we have to sort through there to be able to make the most of the situation, the context that we find ourselves in. So we'll be exploring all of that together. As we get started, I wanted to share their bio with all the listeners. Joan Landino and Jane Buckley are the therapy twins, identical twin sisters, licensed caregivers, and lifelong seekers who use their brand of humor and vulnerability to tell revealing stories about their childhood, family, marriages, divorces, dating, and motherhood. Their mission is to help people love more, fear less. Masters of Science in Nursing from Columbia University in the city of New York, and registered nurses at Yale New Haven Hospital, CT, for 16 years. With a combined 75 years of experience, the therapy twins have learned a lot, and they want to bring their wisdom to you. And that's what I love. I love when people like yourselves are willing and able to share really great insights with all of us so that we can live more healthy lives. As we get started, anything else you would like to share by way of your personal background or history before we launch into the conversation?
One of the things we like to share with people is that being psychiatric nurses and then psychiatric nurse practitioners for years, we found that in our own relationship, it was so chaotic and almost embarrassing that we knew how to help other people, but not ourselves. And we had to, at least for me, dumb down all the psychobabble and get real about relationships, that what they're all about, their differences and similarities, so that we could get along. And we just want to share our wisdom.
Yeah, ditto. That's great. Ditto. Excellent. Spoken like a true twin. I imagine you finish each other's sentences and can do all sorts of fun things together,
yes.
Huh?
Yes, we also interrupt the sentences to guide it back to whoever wants it to be about them.
Perfect. I do that. I come from a family of 8 children, so I do that with my siblings. I can only imagine how it is with a twin. Well, that's wonderful, and I appreciate you sharing that. And it is important to recognize, I mean, the reality is what we do in our professional lives, it should feed over into how we interact in our personal relationships. But sometimes we get, I don't know, sloppy, lazy, we take it for granted, whatever the case may be. And some of those things that we should be doing at home doesn't always happen. My wife will be the first to say, I talk about these issues all the time. I counsel people, I coach people, I mentor people at work all the time. We talk about effective communication, and then, we're at home and, I'm not always great. I can do better. So I think that's a good reminder for all of us that we need to always focus on these things. And a lot of times it's just focusing on the simple things.
Absolutely.
Well, very good. Very good. As we start off, I thought maybe you can first talk a little bit about the relationship between cultures that we find ourselves in. And we all wear a lot of hats. We have a variety of roles, and we're involved in different cultures, whether it be a workplace culture, community, neighborhood culture, family cultures, whatever. Talk a little bit about the relationship between those cultures and the bonds that we form as families.
One of the things that I think about when you mention something like that is the secrecy that just travels from a nuclear family all the way to the absolute top. And it just made me think about, we were raised, if our older sister Lori were here, she would be completely disagreeing, saying that's not the family I grew up in, as I share something. We grew up in a family that, as long as everything appeared to look well connected to the community and kind of perfect, then everything was okay. And I felt very, as if it was a rule in the family, like, you know, no hitting might be, don't share any of these things. And I found it very difficult, because I remember one time I shared something stupid that I won't go into, and oh my goodness, the uproar in the family, it was just, everything got so uneasy and uncomfortable. And then I think about how the secrets spread into our societies, and, you know, different cultures, different secrets, and how interesting that is, because the best way to solve that problem is just, if people could be a little less judgmental, meaning more tolerant, more compassionate, more forgiving, we wouldn't have to have these kinds of secrets. And then I believe everybody would learn a lot faster through experience.
Wow.
Yeah, and we have these secrets because of insecurities rooted in distrust, fear of judgment, of how we may or may not be stacking up to external expectations, whatever the case may be. And what you're describing is not unique to your family by, you know, any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I think that's a fairly common kind of a thing, and I agree. I mean, I can, it resonates with me. I can think back to how that was in my family as well. And you just have to have some level of willingness to be open and transparent and vulnerable with each other within the home, but also to reach out to others outside of the home if and when you need help. And things aren't always rosy. No, I don't know anybody who lives a perfect life who doesn't have any problems. Everyone has their stuff. And so, you know, we can either try to deal with it on our own, or we can band together and try to work together to solve the challenges that we face.
Absolutely. And when I think about mental illness too, that has to be such a secret. And people are so super embarrassed about coming out with their own mental illness. And like Joan says, if you broke your arm, you know, you might just shout it out to the world. But people are so afraid to have that label, because then, right? And then they're treated differently by society, and of course within their own families.
And even within our own profession, we were taught the whole time I was in school, I can't speak for Jane, never come out with your mental illness. If you had mental illness, you were never to share that during any clinical. And I'm thinking, if somebody had a heart attack, or like Jane said, broke their arm, of course you would share that. There's no reason. Again, the stigma within our own profession absolutely trickles down to society.
Well, and that's so interesting. I've never heard that before about therapists. I come from a therapist family. All of my parents and all of my siblings are in some form of they're therapists, counselors, social workers. I'm the oddball out. But I joke, I kind of do the same thing that they do. I just do it within organizational settings as opposed to family and individual settings. But you know, it absolutely is the case. I think that the world we grew up in was less comfortable with messiness, and the world we're in now kind of demands more transparency, authenticity, and vulnerability. In part, that's just due to free flowing information. You know, trying to keep those secrets or privacy, you know, it's much harder today than it was when I was a kid or when you were a kid. And whether that's good or bad, it's the way it is. And, you know, can we function in more healthy ways? I think so. Again, coming back to what you both said, it requires us to be able to recognize when things are hard, to be able to talk about them. If I have had an episode of depression, why should me sharing anything about that diminish how others view me in my capacities and capabilities professionally moving into the future. Why should that matter? It shouldn't. I don't think it matters as much anymore as it used to, but those stigmas still hold tight, I think, to a lot of people.
Yeah. So the DSM cooperated and pretty much labeled almost every human behavior as a disorder at this point. So we're all in good company.
we all got our stuff, that's for sure. So let's talk about trauma. Why don't you define for me what you mean by trauma when you're working with clients? How do you approach that? You just mentioned, how everything gets kind of labeled as a disorder nowadays. How does that relate to trauma? And then how do we go about dealing with that? We can talk about it more generally in, home life, personal life, and then let's look at it from the vantage point of an organizational setting and leaders working with their people.
Well, usually when somebody comes to our office, it's either sadness or depression, anxiety, they can't sleep, or they have no attention span. And oftentimes at the very end of the hour, you end up finding out that there was some sort of trauma. So you always want to rule out the trauma because again, for the first time right now, trauma causes all of those things. So why label it as 3 things when you could actually say, wow, this is trauma, but it would take probably more than the first session. But once you realize it's trauma, you're not going to just put a Band-Aid on the depression because sure, the medicine or the therapy might work for a little bit, but unless you go through briefly, I might add, that trauma and recognize it and move forward, then you're going to stay in it. Oftentimes there are groups about trauma and those people get worse overall because they're talking about the trauma so much, they're back in it. And I forgot the second half of that question. Do you remember?
Well, I think that's great. So the second half was, not just how we deal with it and recognize it in our personal lives, but within the workplace. Because what I see when I'm working with individuals in my consulting work, or if, in my leadership roles in organizations I find myself in, it's one, like the stigma is declining in terms of, acknowledging that you need mental health supports. You've dealt with trauma in your personal life, but in the workplace, there's still like this huge stigma around like, leave your personal stuff at home. When you're at work, be professional, put on your mask, put on your facade, be quote unquote professional. Right. And so, in the idea that someone could come in and say, they had a panic attack and they haven't been sleeping, and they have this individual at work who's been bullying them, or to be able to talk about those things openly can be really, really difficult because it's perceived, whether it's real or not, the perception is there that if they are open about those things, then it will negatively impact their job, their career, their opportunity to progress in the organization, especially if they're speaking out against someone who's above them in the hierarchy. Okay, so I'm not sure at what point I cut out and that you weren't able to hear.
I think you were asking something about how can we start in the workplace to deal with people that might have a mental illness and be able to come in and say, I got no sleep, or I had a panic attack.
Yeah, so the question I have for you is like, what would you suggest to leaders who are listening to this, who want to know how they can be more supportive of their people, of the individuals on their team, who may be dealing with their own personal traumas? Because often in the workplace, we say, be professional, leave that stuff at home. But we know that it all spills over. Like, there's no way to demarcate that so clearly. And especially during this past 13, 14 months during the pandemic, where our personal and work lives have bled together and people are working remotely, I think leaders need to be much more proactive about helping to create a psychologically safe environment at work where these types of things can be explored and you can find ways to support your people. Any thoughts on how leaders can go about doing that more effectively?
I have a lot of thoughts, and my biggest one is, because this is like such a pet peeve of mine, having suffered from severe depression and in the past. If people could just, we talked about transparency with the media world nowadays, we're forced to be more transparent. But what seems to be lacking is the forgiveness part, the compassionate part, the tolerant part, the non-judgmental part. So it's getting to the point where all this transparency is really making people go back to those family lies, because we're so afraid of the judgment and the intolerance and the unforgivingness and, labels, people suicide over labels. In fact, a former colleague of ours suicided after a bit of a scandal. Instead of, being a forgiving world and where we know discipline is teaching, doesn't have to always be punitive.
Oh, right.
Right.
Mhm.
And those are just some of the things. Like, I can go on and on all day about this because it makes me very upset when I talk about it.
Well, that reminds me when I was a brand new nurse. So I was a brand new nurse and I made 5 major mistakes where people actually got hurt. Nobody died, but people got hurt. And when I had my evaluation, I got a raise and I just didn't understand. I thought I'd be fired. And what the director of nursing said was, Joan, you show growth. You did not make the same mistake twice. She said, so therefore, when we taught you, you learned. So, Jane says discipline is teaching. Today, I have seen nurses walked out by security for making a mistake. So the intolerance today is possibly brought on about political correctness, which is almost inhuman, especially if you have a learning disability. I was born with a brain tumor, and the intolerance of certain things that sometimes, I'm not capable of, but the judgment, which I'm not going to go into, but anyway, yeah, the intolerance at the workplace. So therefore, I grew as a nurse and I got better. Whereas if I got fired, obviously that wouldn't have gone well.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So as I consider all of this within an organizational context, I think of, people do misstep, and part of having a psychologically safe workplace environment and culture is that people need to know that they can make quote unquote mistakes. I wouldn't even call them mistakes. It's just iterating. It's learning, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Everyone's going to misstep, especially if you're trying to push the envelope and innovate and create new things. You're always going to have things that don't work out. And so you need an environment where people know that they're empowered to try. Now, you shouldn't make the same mistake many times. Like, you need to learn from the missteps and lean into the messiness, the uncertainty, and ultimately fail fast, fall forward. Those kinds of ways of looking at things, I think, are important. But I need to be able to help my people recognize, both in the work that they do as well as the stuff that they have, the emotional, the psychological stuff that they got going on inside of themselves, that it's okay to have bad days. It's okay to not always be perfect. And it's quite unhealthy in our personal life, certainly in the workplace too. We spend so much of our time, our waking lives at work. Like, it's not psychologically healthy for us to be putting on a facade all the time. We need to be authentic, and we need to be allowed to be vulnerable. And if that means that you can show up and say, you know what, this crap happened at home and it's hard, and just given some space where you can just deal with that a little bit and have people who can listen, not judge you. And if you do make a quote unquote mistake, that you can own up to it, and then people won't judge you for it. They'll forgive you for it, and you'll do the same for them. That's a dynamic environment with mutual relationships of trust where you can support each other. And unfortunately, that often isn't the case within organizations and within teams, and people don't feel like they can open up that way. And so they bear their burden silently. They put on the facade. They smile at everyone. They say they had a great weekend, even though, they're dealing with whatever they're dealing with, and they're not getting the support they need.
Absolutely. It's a shame because it's goes all the way to the nuclear family, all the way up to the way any government might be run. And Joan and I like to look at nature. I think Joan likes to look at nature more than I do. But, nature, if we look at it, all the way into the solar system, it all runs perfectly. And we don't understand all of it, but we're all eager to observe and do experiments and say, this is how it's working. But, if we would just study some animals, the human being is an animal. And if we looked at animals, I think, Joan, did you want to tell the thing about the deer?
Within a group of deer, if you're the head deer, you just, you're all grazing and stuff, but you're thinking about, well, that's the head deer. So you're thinking everyone's going to follow him. And within that population, it's when 51% of the deer look one specific way, that's when that tribe of deer know that that's the watering hole we're going to go to, and it's the safest. So again, it's about survival of the herd, though. And as we said, humans are animals, but we are definitely not into survival of the herd. We're into survival of me. That's why we don't act like those lovely animals out that last and last. Yeah, we don't act like that. We cheat at that circle. We cheat.
And I'd like to share that, of course, we know the lion is the king of the jungle, right? So we might liken the lion to whoever has the money that runs the world. And one of the things I think about is the lion can probably go to any area of his nature or her nature, sit down and pretty much put up a flag and say, this is mine. And the other animals do have to move over. But I don't ever see or hear about the lion taking, say, 75% of the wealth of nature and leaving everybody else, that
to
small
die and
piece
rot.
to die around. Because the lion knows if it's not working properly, then I'm not going to have this life of luxury.
Again, the human animal doesn't look at it that way. Again, follow the money, follow the greed. Even within the nuclear family, I don't blame people. It's an instinct. I want my family to survive. So you're going to hoard the food if it's the end of the world because your family needs to eat. I never had children, so I don't understand that concept, but I'm sure you both do.
Well, yeah, I think that's so important. And we definitely are social animals, aren't we? And I think this past year has illustrated that. There's been a lot of psychological trauma and social isolation has driven up, the unhealthy behaviors, abuse, domestic violence, those sorts of things have risen over the past year. Incidences of depression and anxiety and suicidality have increased over the past year. So we're social animals. We need each other. And so we need within the workplace to create an environment where we can be there for each other.
We really do. I want to say opiate deaths are also up in our nation. And yes, we with isolation, though, we can become very removed from things and therefore become less empathetic, tolerant, compassionate, etc. Of others. And then it seems like now that everything, we're all getting vaccinated and things are opening up, we might start for a little while with that herd or group mentality that can work because we are social creatures. But you know where I'm going with this.
I have no idea where you're going.
Sometimes a group, think of the group that's going to be the audience for the lynching. Groups can be wonderful and the agent of change in a positive way, and then they can become very judgmental and too politically correct, and we can have too many lynchings.
Yeah. Well, it has really, this has been a fascinating discussion. The time has flown by. I want to be respectful of your time. And I acknowledge that we're needing to close things up. But before we end, I did want to make sure that I gave you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about the work that the two of you do, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Well, you can get in touch with us just going by Therapy Twins, one word, therapytwins.com, not the Rappy Twins. On Twitter, we had a lot of rapper followers because they thought we were rappers, but we aren't. We're still psychiatric nurse practitioners. But instead of working individually, we have decided to combine our experience and our knowledge and work together because we believe two heads are really better than one.
And remember, discipline is teaching.
Absolutely. Ditto.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. It has really been a pleasure. I encourage listeners to reach out, to get connected, find out more about the Therapy Twins and what they can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.